Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you a gentleman whose great learning, historical accuracy, and veneration for the truth are equaled only by his high moral character and majestic presence. I refer, in these vague, general terms, to myself. I'm not normally a proponent of introductions, but if it is a custom, I prefer to do the act myself. I know, I'll get all the facts in. I was once introduced at a Hartford dinner club by a lawyer who kept his hands in his pockets the whole time he was talking. He said, "I'd like to introduce Mr. Mark Twain, a humorist who is really funny. A rare creature indeed." Well, I was struck nearly dumb by this complimentary thunderbolt, remarkable for both its brevity and its accuracy. But we had something even more rare in our midst than a humorist who was really funny, a lawyer who kept his hands in his own pockets. I'm a border ruffian from the state of Missouri by birth. I'm a Connecticut Yankee by adoption. In me you have both Missouri morals and Connecticut culture. This is the combination which makes the perfect man. I was born humble, but it wore off. One of the results of a long and notorious career is that you receive a great many requests for advice. I'm often asked to address groups of young people and advise them on the proper approach to life. And I'm always delighted to do it, for I've had some things in my mind that I've often longed to say for the instruction of the young. Just a few simple rules that I'll pass along to you now and suggest you distribute about the neighborhood. Now, you always want to begin by saying, "My dear young friends, always obey your parents when they are present." This is the best policy in the long run, because if you don't, they will make you. Most parents believe they know better than you do, and you can generally make more by humoring that superstition than you can by acting on your own better judgment. Always be respectful to your superiors, if you have any, also to strangers, and sometimes to other people. If a person offends you, and you are uncertain as to whether or not it was intentional, do not resort to extreme measures. Simply wait for your chance and hit him with a brick. That will be sufficient. Then, if you find out that no offense was intended, come out flatly and confess yourself in the wrong when you hit him. Say you didn't mean to. But always avoid violence. In this age of charity and kindliness, the time for such things has gone by. Leave dynamite to the low and the unrefined. Go to bed early, get up early. Now this is very wise. Some people say you should get up with the sun. Some people say get up with one thing, others another. But a lark really is the best thing to get up with. It gives you a splendid reputation with everyone to know that you get up with a lark. And if you find the right sort of lark and train them properly, you can get up by 9:30 easily, every time. Now, as to lying, my dear young friends, you've got to be awfully careful about lying. Otherwise, you're nearly sure to be caught. Some authorities maintain that the young ought not to lie at all. Well, that is putting it rather strongly. Still, while I don't go that far, I do maintain and believe that I'm right, that the young ought to be temperate in their use of this great art until practice and experience shall give them the confidence, elegance, and precision which alone can make the accomplishment graceful and profitable. Build your character carefully and painstakingly upon these precepts, and by, when you've got it built, you'll be surprised and delighted by how nicely and sharply it resembles everyone else's. There are a great many sorts of books, but good ones are for the young to read. They are a great and unspeakable means of improvement. Therefore, you've got to be very careful in your selections. Confine yourselves to such works as The Innocents Abroad, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and other works of that nature. Another book I'd recommend for the young and for some adults is A Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. I would have expected more of you to have picked it up, but I'm told very few of you have. Therefore, in an effort to enlighten you and to boost sales, I'd like to read to you from the first chapter. Chapter 1, The Stranger's History. I am an American. I was born and reared in Hartford, in the state of Connecticut anyway, just over the river in the country. So I am a Yankee of the Yankees. And practical, yes, and nearly barren of sentiment, I suppose, or poetry in other words. My father was a blacksmith. My uncle was a horse doctor. And I was both, along at first. Then I went over to the great arms factory and learned my real trade. Learned all there was to it. Learned to make everything. Guns, revolvers, cannon, boilers, engines, all sorts of labor-saving machinery. Well, I could make anything a body wanted, anything in the world. It didn't make any difference what. And if there wasn't a quick, newfangled way to make a thing, I could invent one and do it as easy as rolling off a log. I became head superintendent. I had a couple of 1,000 men under me. Well, a man like that is a man that is full of fight. That goes without saying. With a couple of 1,000 rough men under one has plenty of that sort of amusement. I had anyway. At last I met my match, and I got my dose. It was during a misunderstanding conducted with crowbars with a fellow we used to call Hercules. He laid me out with a crusher alongside the head that made everything crack and seemed to spring every joint in my skull and make it overlap its neighbor. Then the world went out in darkness, and I didn't feel anything more and didn't know anything at all. At least for a while. When I came to again, I was sitting under an oak tree on the grass, with a whole beautiful and broad country landscape all to myself. Nearly. Not entirely, for there was a fella on a horse, looking down at me, a fella fresh out of a picture book. He was in old-time iron armor from head to heel, with a helmet on his head the shape of a nail keg with slits in it. And he had a shield, and a sword, and a prodigious spear. And his horse had armor on too, and a steel horn projecting from its forehead, and gorgeous red and green silk trappings that hung down all around him like a bedquilt nearly to the ground. "Fair sir, will you joust?" said this fellow. "Will I which? Will you try passage of arms for land or lady or for—" "What are you giving me?" I said. "Get along back to your circus, or I'll report you." Now, what does this man do but fall back a couple of 100 yards, and then come rushing at me as hard as he could tear, with his nail keg bent down nearly to his horse's neck, and his long spears pointed straight ahead. I saw he meant business, so I was up the tree when he arrived. He allowed that I was his property, the captive of his spear. There was argument on his side, and the bulk of the advantage, so I judged it best to humor him. We fixed up an agreement whereby I was to go with him, and he was not to hurt me. I came down, and we started away, I walking by the side of his horse. We marched comfortably along, through glades and over brooks, which I could not remember having seen before, which made me wonder. And yet we did not come to a circus or any sign of a circus. So I gave up on the idea of a circus and concluded he was from an asylum. But we never came to an asylum, so I was up a stump, as you may say. I asked him how far we were from Hartford. He said he had never heard of the place, which I took to be a lie, but allowed it to go at that. At the end of an hour, we saw a faraway town sleeping in a valley by a winding river, and beyond it, on a hill, a vast gray fortress with towers and turrets, the first I had ever seen out of a picture. "Bridgeport?" said I, pointing. "Camelot," said he. Well, now perhaps some of you will pick up the novel, but I expect few of you shall. Unfortunately, it's become a classic, something everyone wants to have read, but no one wants to read. As a young man, I headed out to San Francisco, seeking to reform the citizens of that city. I soon discovered there was little chance of reforming folks in San Francisco, so, faced with the prospect of becoming either a burglar or a journalist, I chose the less profitable of the two evils. Soon found myself in Honolulu, assigned as special correspondent for the Sacramento Union to the Sandwich Islands. When the missionaries first arrived in those islands, the locals came to greet them wearing nothing at all, not even a blush. Later, these same natives would come to church, adorned only with smiles. This caused some consternation amongst the clergy, who did not know the proper protocol for a naked congregation. This particular distraction had been generally overlooked in missionary school. At first, the missionaries were nonplussed. Then they remembered the central teaching of their training, that nothing needs reforming so much as other people's habits. They asked the natives to not come to church naked, explaining that it's hard enough to get into heaven fully clothed. Attempting it naked borders on blasphemy. I do believe there's a lesson there. Clothes make the man. Naked people have almost no influence in society. These missionaries had braved 1,000 privations to come and make the locals permanently miserable. First, by telling them what a beautiful and blissful place heaven is, and how nearly impossible it is to get there, and then what a dismal and dreary place perdition is, and how easy it is to get there. How sad it is to think of the multitudes who went to their graves in those beautiful islands and never knew there was a hell. The language of the islanders is soft and liquid and flexible, perfectly efficient and satisfactory in every way, until you get mad. And then there you are. There's nothing in it to swear with. I couldn't stay in those islands. I couldn't swear in the native tongue, and attempts in my own language were a waste of both breath and artistry. Under certain circumstances, dire circumstances, profanity provides a relief denied even to prayer. If I cannot swear in heaven, I shall not stay. When I reflect upon the number of disagreeable people who I know have gone on to a better world, I am moved to lead a different life. I knew a man once who lived his entire life aiming at heaven. When he got there, the first person he saw was an acquaintance he had been hoping was in hell the entire time. Dispirited, he picked up his satchel and asked directions to the other place. And there it is. Heaven for the weather. Hell for the company. As for me, upon passing, I do hope to be cremated. I mentioned this once to our pastor, Reverend Twitchell, and he replied, "Oh, I shouldn't worry about that if I had your chances." But on the subject of the afterlife, I try to remain silent. I must out of necessity. I have friends in both places. Man really is the most remarkable jackass. He fancies himself the maker's pet. Thinks the deity sits up nights admiring him. He sets himself up as the reasoning animal. But I can find no evidence to support this self-aggrandizing claim, and much evidence to contradict it. I've been studying our species for years now, and I find the results humiliating. Among my experiments was this. I took a cat and a dog, and I put them together in a cage. In an hour, I taught them to be friends. Then I added a rabbit. In another hour, I taught them to be friends. Over the course of 2 days, I was able to add a fox, a goose, a squirrel, some doves, a kangaroo, and finally a monkey. They lived together in peace, even affectionately. Next, I caught an Irish Catholic, put him in a cage. When he seemed tame enough, I added a Presbyterian, then a Turk from Constantinople, a Methodist from the wilds of Arkansas, a Buddhist from China, and finally, a Salvation Army colonel. When I came back the next day to note the results, there wasn't a specimen left alive. These reasoning animals had disagreed on a theological detail and carried the matter to a higher court. Man is not the reasoning animal. Man is the religious animal. He's the only religious animal. He's the only one that's got the true religion. Several of them. He's the only animal that loves his neighbor as himself and will cut his throat if he hasn't got his theology straight. Why, he's made a graveyard of the globe, doing his level best to smooth his brother's way to happiness and to heaven. Man is the only animal that blushes, or needs to. I've heard people talk about man being adapted for the earth. but I can't see how they arrived at that idea. He can't sleep out of doors without freezing to death or getting rheumatism. Can't keep his nose underwater for more than a minute without being drowned. Well, he can't even climb a tree without falling and breaking his neck. He's got to be coddled and housed and bandaged and upholstered to be able to live at all. He's a regular museum of infirmities. He's always undergoing repairs. A machine as unreliable as he is would have no market at all. A man starts in as a child and lives on disease as a regular diet till the end. He has mumps, measles, whooping cough, tonsillitis, croup as a matter of course. Then as he goes along, his life is threatened at every turn by coughs, colds, asthma, bronchitis, influenza, pneumonia, carbuncles, and a whole catalog of new ones that haven't even been invented yet. What is his appendix for? It has no value. Its sole interest is to lie in wait for stray grape seeds and to breed trouble. Man is even handsome as compared to the birds. When as for style, well, look at the Bengal tiger, that ideal of grace and majesty. Look at him, and look at man, that poor creature. The animal of the wig, the ear trumpet, the glass eye, the porcelain teeth, the silver windpipe. A creature that is patched and mended from top to bottom. Why, if he can't get renewals of his bric-a-brac in the next world, what is he going to look like? Well, you just have to remember that man was made at the end of the week, when God was tired. I reverently believe that the deity makes everything in New England except for the weather. I'm not sure who makes that, but I think it must be the raw apprentices in the weather factory who are still learning how and experimenting. There's a sumptuous variety to the New England weather that compels the stranger's admiration and regret. It gets up to more business in spring than any other season. In the spring, I have counted 136 different kinds of weather inside of 4 and 20 hours. The people of New England are by nature patient and forbearing, but there are some things which they will not stand. Every year, they kill a lot of poets for writing about beautiful spring. These are usually casual visitors who bring their notions of spring from somewhere else and cannot, of course, know how the natives feel about spring. One of the brightest gems in the New England weather is the dazzling uncertainty of it. You can only be certain of one thing. You can be certain there'll be plenty of it, a perfect grand review. But you can never tell which end of the procession will start moving first. You fix up for the drought, leave your umbrella at home, sally out, and 2 to 1, you'll get drowned. You make up your mind that the earthquake is due, take hold of something to steady yourself. Next thing you know, you get struck by lightning. These are great disappointments, of course, but they can't be helped. The lightning here is peculiar. It's so convincing that when it strikes a thing, it doesn't leave enough of that thing behind for you to tell what it had been. You think it had been something valuable, and find out later that a congressman had been standing there. And the thunder. When the thunder begins to merely key up for the performance, and scrape and saw and tune up, strangers will say, "My, what awful thunder you have here." But when the baton is raised and the real concert begins, you'll find that stranger down in the cellar, with his head in the ash barrel.
What?
I'd like to read you a selection from Huckleberry Finn. Now, Huckleberry Finn is a story of a boy who lived in the Mississippi River Valley a great many years ago. He was ignorant, unwashed, insufficiently fed, but he had as good a heart as any boy ever had, and he was the only truly independent person, boy or man, in the community. And for that reason, I suppose, he was continually happy. We liked him. We admired him. We enjoyed his society. And since his society was forbidden by our parents, we enjoyed it all the more. Now, in this book, Huckleberry tells his own story. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly. There was something he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That ain't nothing. I never seen anybody but lied one time or another, without it was Aunt Polly or the widow Douglas. The widow, she took me for her son and allowed she would civilize me. She put me in some of them new clothes, and I couldn't do nothing but sweat and feel all cramped up. Pretty soon I wanted to smoke, but she wouldn't let me. She said it was a mean practice and weren't clean, and I must try not to do it anymore. Ain't that just the way with some people? They get down on a thing when they don't know about it. She took snuff, too. Her sister, Miss Watson, a tolerable slim old maid with goggles on, took a set at me with a spelling book. She worked me middling hard for about an hour or so, and then the widow made her ease up. Then for another hour it was deadly dull, and I was fidgety. Miss Watson all the time saying, "Don't put your feet up there, Huckleberry. Don't scrunch up like that, Huckleberry. Sit up straight. Can't you try to behave?" Then she told me about the bad place, and I said I wished I was there. She got mad then, but I never meant no harm. All I wanted was a change. All I wanted was to go somewheres. I weren't particular. She said she was going to live so as to go to the good place. Well, I couldn't see no advantage to going to where she was going, so I made up my mind I wouldn't try for it. I run off pretty soon after that and hit out on Jackson's Island. That's where I met Miss Watson's Jim. He says he run off too. I promised I wouldn't tell on him. Jim and me, we found an empty section of log raft, and we set off down that river together. We run nights and laid up and hid daytimes. We just let that raft float wherever the current wanted her to. We'd lay on our backs and smoke our pipes, looking way up in the sky. Not a cloud in it. The sky looks ever so deep when you lay on your back in the moonshine. I never knew that before. And how far a body can hear on the water. Such nights. We kept looking for Cairo at the bottom of the Illinois where the Ohio River comes in. We said we'd sell the raft and get on a steamboat and go way up the Ohio amongst the free states and then be out of trouble. Jim said it made him all over trembly and feverish to be so close to freedom. Well, I can tell you it made me all over trembly and feverish too to hear him. Because I'd begun to get it through my head that he was most free. And who was to blame for it? Why, me. I couldn't get that out of my conscience, no how or no way. It got to troubling me so I couldn't rest. I couldn't stay in one place. It had never come home to me before what this thing was I was doing, but now it did, and it stayed with me and scorched me more and more. I tried to make out to myself that I weren't to blame because I didn't run off Jim from his rightful owner. But it weren't no use. Conscience up and says every time, but you knowed he was running for his freedom, and you could have paddled ashore and told somebody. That was so. I couldn't get around that anyway. That was where it pinched. Conscience says to me, what had poor Miss Watson done to you that you could see her slave go off right under your eyes and never say a single word? What did that poor old woman do to you that you could treat her so mean? Why, she tried to learn you your book. She tried to learn you your manners. She tried to be good to you in every way she knowed how. That's what she'd done. I got to feeling so mean and so miserable, I most wished I was dead. I fidgeted up and down the raft, abusing myself to myself, and Jim was fidgeting up and down past me. I mean, neither of us could keep still. Every time he says, "There's Cairo," it went through me like a shot. I thought if it was Cairo, I reckoned I would die of miserableness. Jim talked out loud all the time while I was talking to myself. He was saying how the first thing he would do when he got to a free state, he would go to saving up money and never spend a single cent. And when he got enough, he would buy his wife, which was owned on a farm close to where Miss Watson lived. And then they would both work to buy the 2 children. And if their master wouldn't sell them, they'd get an abolitionist to go and steal them. It most froze me to hear such talk. He wouldn't ever dare to talk such talk in his life before. Just see what a difference it made in him the minute he judged he was about free. Thinks I, this is what comes of my not thinking. Here was this slave which I had as good as helped run away, coming right out flat-footed and saying he would steal his children. Children that belonged to a man I didn't even know. A man that had never done me no harm. My conscience got to stirring me up hotter than ever, until at last I says to it, "Let up on me, it ain't too late. I'll paddle ashore at first light and tell." I felt easy and happy and light as a feather right off. All my troubles were gone. I went to looking out sharp for a light and sort of singing to myself. By and by one showed. Jim sings out, "We're safe, Huck, we're safe. Jump up and crack your heels. There's good old Cairo. I just know it is." "I'll take the canoe and go see Jim. It mightn't be, you know." He jumped up and got the canoe ready and put his old coat on the bottom for me to sit on and give me the paddle. And as I shoved off, he says, "Pretty soon I'll be shouting for joy, and I'll say, 'It's all on accounts of Huck.' I was a free man. I couldn't ever have been free if it hadn't been for Huck. Huck done it. Jim won't ever forget you, Huck. You was the best friend Jim ever had, and he's the only friend old Jim's got now." I was paddling off, all in a sweat to tell on him, but when he says this, it seemed to take the tuck all out of me. I went along slow then, and I weren't right down certain whether I was glad I started or whether I weren't. When I was 50 yards off, Jim says, "There you goes, old true Huck, the only white gentleman that ever kept his promise to me." Well, I just felt sick. But I says, "I got to do it. I can't get out of it." Right then, along comes a skiff with 2 men on it with guns. They stopped, and I stopped. One of them says, "What's that yonder?" "A piece of raft," I says. "You belong on it?" "Yes, sir." "Any men on it?" "Only one, sir." "Well, there's 5 niggers run off tonight, up yonder above the head of the bend. Is your man white or black?" I didn't answer up prompt. I tried to, but the words wouldn't come. I tried for a second to brace up and out with it, but I weren't man enough. I see I was weakening, so I just give up trying, and I say, "He's white." They went off, and I got aboard the raft, feeling bad and low because I knowed very well I had done wrong, and I see it weren't no use for me to try to learn to do right. Then I thought a minute and says to myself, "Hold on. Suppose you had done right and give Jim up. Would you feel better than what you do now?" "No," says I. "I'd feel bad. I'd feel just the same way I do now." "Well then," says I, "what's the use of you learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and ain't no trouble to do wrong, and the wages is just the same?" I was stuck. I couldn't answer that. When I first came to Hartford, looking to publish my novel, The Innocents Abroad, I caught a bad cold, not yet being used to the New England weather. A woman at the hotel recommended I drink a quart of whiskey every 24 hours. Later that same day, I was introduced to Mr. William Howells, who recommended the same thing. That made a half gallon. I had been drunk before, but that was a masterpiece. I survived. The cold didn't. I've developed a style of life which suits me perfectly. I take no exercise except sleeping and resting, nor do I intend to. Exercise is loathsome. What is the benefit of being tired? I take my only exercise acting as a pallbearer at the funerals of my friends who exercise regularly. I'm not much of one for moderation myself, but I do make it a rule never to smoke when asleep and never to refrain when awake. It's a good rule. For me, I mean. Some of you know quite well it wouldn't answer for everybody. When I first began smoking at 10 or 11 years of age, they told me I'd shorten my life by 10 years of smoking. Well, I got scared and gave it up for 2 or 3 hours. Then I decided the extra decade wouldn't be worth living without smoking and resumed the habit immediately. As for drinking, I have no rule about that. When others drink, I like to help. Otherwise, I remain dry by habit and preference. I do drink 2 hot whiskeys every night before bed, but that's for the prevention of the toothache. I've never had a toothache, nor do I intend to. But take no notice of my habits. We can't reach old age by another man's road. My habits protect my life, well, they'd probably assassinate you. No, you have to make your own rules and stick to them. Now, it's not as easy as it sounds, for there'll always be someone trying to reform you. To tell the truth, I don't think this reforming sticks very well anyway. I've always clung to the theory that you can straighten the worm out, but the crook is still in him, only waiting. My dear wife, God rest her soul, tried diligently for years to get me to give up profanity. And I tried, but had very little success. For the first 10 years of my married life, I kept a constant and discreet watch upon my tongue while in the house, and went outside for some distance when circumstances proved too much for me and I was obliged to seek relief. I prized my wife's respect and approval above all the rest of the human races, and dreaded the day when she would discover my hypocrisy. But at last, an incident exposed me. I had gone into the bathroom to get ready for the day and carelessly left the door 2 or 3 inches ajar. It was the first time I'd forgotten to take the precaution of closing it tightly. I knew the necessity of being particular about this because shaving was always a trying ordeal for me, and I could seldom see it through without verbal helps. This time I was unprotected and did not know it. I had no extraordinary trouble with my razor on this occasion and was able to worry through with mere mutterings and growlings of an improper sort, but nothing loud or emphatic, no snapping or barking. Then I put on a shirt. A button was missing. My temper jumped up several degrees in a moment, and my remarks rose accordingly, both in loudness and in vigor of expression. I flung open the window and threw the shirt out. It fell upon the shrubbery below, where passers-by on their way to church could admire it, if they wanted to. Still rumbling and thundering distantly, I put on another shirt. Again a button was absent. I augmented my language to meet the emergency and threw that shirt out the window. I was too angry, too insane to inspect the third shirt, but put it furiously on. Again a button was absent, and that shirt followed its comrades out the window. Then I straightened up, gathered my reserves, and let myself go like a cavalry charge. In the midst of that great assault, my eye fell upon the gaping door, and I was paralyzed. I tried to hope that Mrs. Clemens was still asleep, but knew better. I couldn't escape by the window. It was narrow and suited only to shirts. At last, I made up my mind to bodily loaf through the bedroom with the air of a person who has not been doing anything. I made half the journey successfully, but I could feel my confidence in my performance oozing steadily out of me as I went along. I had to stop in the middle of the room. I hadn't the strength to go on. I felt like I was under accusing eyes, that even the carved angels on the bedpost were inspecting me with unfriendly gaze. You know how it is when you're convinced that someone behind you is staring at you. You have to turn your face. You can't help it. I turned mine. Against the white pillows, I saw that young and beautiful face and those gracious eyes with something in them which I had never seen there before. They were snapping and flashing with indignation. I felt myself crumbling. I stood there, silent, under that desolating fire for as much as a minute. Then my wife's lips parted, and from them issued my latest remark from the bathroom. The language was perfect, but the expression unpracticed, apprentice-like, absurdly weak and unsuited to the great language. I never heard anything so out of tune, so ill-suited to one another as those mighty words set to that feeble music. I tried to keep from laughing, for I was a guilty person in great need of charity and mercy. I tried to keep from bursting, and succeeded, until she gravely said, "There, now you know how it sounds." Well, then I exploded. I said, "Oh, Livy, if it sounded like that, God forgive me, I shall never do it again." And then she had to laugh herself. We both went into convulsions and went on laughing until we were both exhausted. There really ought to be a room in every house to swear in. Although I was raised in the most exclusive circles of Missouri, I never attended a Wagnerian opera. So, while I was visiting Germany, I went and I took in Parsifal, and I shall never forget it. The first act occupied 2 hours, and I enjoyed it, in spite of the singing. although singing does seem the wrong name to apply to it. In Parsifal, there's a character named Grinnermutz, a hermit who stands in one spot on the stage, practicing by the hour, while first one character and then another endures what he can of it and then retires to die. Some of those Wagnerian operas bang along for 6 hours at a stretch. I remember one called Lohengrin. There wasn't much action in it, that is to say, nothing much really happened. It was only talked about, and always violently. It was what you might call a narrative play. In this piece, it was every rider for himself, and no blending. Each character sang out his grievance in turn, and accompanied by the whole orchestra. And, just when one was beginning to hope they'd come to some understanding and modify the noise, a whole chorus of maniacs would suddenly burst forth. And for the next 2 minutes, sometimes 3, I would relive all I suffered at the time the orphan asylum burned down. As a boy, growing up in that small town on the banks of the Mississippi, I and my comrades had but one permanent ambition: to be a steamboat man. Eventually I ran away and learned to be a pilot. A steamboat pilot is one of the few truly free people on the face of this earth. When I stood in the pilot house, I was so high above the water, it was like I was perched upon a mountain. It was a sumptuous glass temple offering a princely view of the mighty Mississippi rolling its mile-wide tide along, shining in the sun. On the 4 o'clock watch, mornings, I can watch the summer sun rise on the water. That was enchanting. I wrote about it in my book, Life on the Mississippi. First, there's the eloquence of silence. Then the haunting sense of loneliness, isolation, remoteness from the worry and bustle of the world. The dawn creeps in stealthily. The solid walls of black forest soften to gray, and vast stretches of the river open up and reveal themselves. The water is glass smooth. There is not the faintest breath of wind or stir of leaf. Then a bird pipes up. Another follows, and soon the pipings develop into a jubilant riot of music. Then, when the light has become a little stronger, you have one of the fairest and softest pictures imaginable. You have the intense green of the massed and crowded foliage nearby. You see it pale and shade by shade in front of you until miles away it sleeps upon the water, a mere dim vapor, barely separable from the sky above it. And all this stretch of river is a mirror, and you have the shadowy reflections of the leafage and curving shores and receding capes pictured in it. Well, all that is beautiful, but when the sun gets welled up and distributes a pink flush here and a powder of gold yonder and a purple haze where it'll yield the best effect, you know you have seen something worth remembering. I had hoped to follow the river for the rest of my days and die at the wheel when my mission was ended, but by and by the war came, commerce on the river ceased, and my occupation was gone. I had to seek a new livelihood. I became a silver miner in Nevada, a gold miner in California, a reporter, a foreign correspondent, an instructional torchbearer on the lecture circuit, and finally, a scribbler of books, one of the immovable objects among the rocks of New England. You know, I am sorry to hear my name mentioned among the great authors because they have such a sad habit of dying off. Chaucer is dead. Spencer is dead. So is Milton. So is Shakespeare. And I'm not feeling very well myself. Well, thank you, and good night.
I went through about 20 to 30 cigars a day. And yet, it's amazing he lived to be almost 75.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that Twain continued to smoke after Grant died of throat cancer. And what's interesting about that is I've seen a reference where Twain, I believe, I'm almost positive it was Twain, asked Dr. Douglas, Grant's, doctor who was a throat specialist, do you believe that the did the cigars contribute? And Dr. Douglas said, I believe it was mostly due to the stress of the financial collapse of General Grant. And so, if the doctor's telling him, I don't think it's cigars, he certainly would have enjoyed that response, I think.
And the science back then, medicine was not great back then anyway, but but also I can't imagine what the house smelled like. In fact, one of Twain's daughters said that Papa is perfect in every way except for his teeth. Well, he's smoking 30 cigars a day. Of course his teeth were bad. And they talk about him having like nicotine stains all in his stash too from all the cigars.
So they certainly shared that in common. Now here's an interesting comparison. This is putting you on the spot, but do you think of anybody in modern times when you think of Mark Twain? Any comparison at all?
The closest I think author-wise and then personality-wise is Kurt Vonnegut. They both were sort of keen observers of human nature and society and commenters on it, but also were very involved in their times. Twain saw the Civil War. Vonnegut was in Dresden during World War II, during the bombing. So I think they're very similar, and they're burned optimists. So they're skeptics, not cynics. Also, the house lore is the last person to actually smoke on the porch of the Twain house was Kurt Vonnegut when he was giving a talk there.
Oh, now Grant obviously faced, great difficulties and personal loss at the end of his life. Now I know that Mark Twain also endured tremendous loss and difficulties, I suppose later in his life. I wonder, did that, color his work after that?
Absolutely. Twain loses first his oldest daughter while he's traveling. He's not even there when his daughter passes away. She dies when she's 24. And then after that, his wife passes away. And these are, he's 10 years older than his wife. So as he starts to lose people that love him, and he says, I think his approach is, I'm the bad person here. Why are the good people in my life being taken from me? And his work gets darker and it's still brilliant, but you can see how wounded he is as time goes on. I think the clearest break is in Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. Connecticut Yankee starts off as this very funny sci-fi novel, and it becomes a very dark anti-war, anti-technology novel, because as he's writing it, people in his family start to die, and also technology turns on him. He invests hundreds and thousands of dollars in this printing machine that he thinks will revolutionize printing, and it fails miserably. So he goes bankrupt in this period too. So the last thing he ever writes, and it was never fully finished, is a work called The Mysterious Stranger, or Number 44, The Mysterious Stranger, which is very, very, very dark and pessimistic. It's brilliantly written, but at the end of his life, you can see how wounded he is. It really comes out in the writing. It's very strong.
Now, here's an interesting question. Do you have any clue as to why there would be any chemistry or friendship between Ulysses S. Grant and Mark Twain?
That's a good question. They're so different. From the readings I've done, it's what really struck me was how much Twain really respected Grant. Twain's usually kind of a cynic about people, but I think with Grant, he really thought he's almost humble to Grant, which is very unusual for him. When he first meets him, he was working as a reporter in Washington. And I think he said something to Grant when he's introduced to him that made Grant kind of snicker. And he was so proud of the fact that he made Grant laugh, because Grant was kind of known as being sort of taciturn. But I think the chemistry might have been that, first of all, Twain said that Grant saved the Union. Like that's, he really, and he said in a letter he writes, he said something about like, he's more impressed by the fact that Grant ended the war, whether he wanted it or not. He ended the war, and that was the thing he really impressed him. But I think he's really impressed with Grant's leadership and the Grant's sort of humble humility. I think Grant, I can't speak as well for Grant, obviously, but I think Grant, Twain's a very funny guy. And I think maybe Grant saw this person who was funny because he's so blatantly honest. He's such a clear grasp of human nature, and maybe that's what impressed Grant. But they're very different people, which is probably why they made them such a good, I think that caused the chemistry. They're so different. And I think they're both people who are famous and probably both dealt with that very I think both of them were kind of uncomfortable being really well known.
I love that, both uncomfortable to be well known, and that seems to be the case. Although I have to admit, from my research, Twain was at least appeared to be much more comfortable
And
presenter than Grant.
yeah,
Yeah.
oh, absolutely. I mean, Twain was a showman. Twain was putting on a show, and there's part of him that loved that. But I think there's a part of him that also said, "Look, I want to just spend time with my family," because a lot of his travels, he's on the road doing these shows, like I was sort of recreating, sort of. He's doing that simply to keep his family in the way they've accustomed to living. He hates, at the end of his life, he hates this traveling, these lectures. He wants to just go home and be with his family. But to do that, he has to do these lectures to make the money to be able to do that. So he loved performing. He really resented that he had to.
It's interesting. It seems like there's a correlation between Grant and Twain, is their absolute devotion and love for their families and how much they didn't like to be separated from them. And I think that's and this is in an era where the man of the family or whatnot would go off and do the have a career and sometimes not spend a lot of time, as much time at home. So that's interesting as well. We do have a question coming through from Gwen. It says, how did you become interested in Mark Twain and doing presentations of him?
Well, it started, I guess, probably my grandfather was a huge Twain fan. So I kind of grew up, being exposed to it. But I was working at the Twain House because it's a fun place to work as a guide. And then I grew the mustache out to be a servant on one of the servants' tours. And then our communications director said, "Your mustache is out of control. Why don't you just be our Sam?" And I thought, why not try it? And the words are so good that they do all the work. So it's really just getting the words in your head. But and I'm trying to get across. There's Twain was very, very, very conscious of his performance. He picked every syllable. His timing was really important to him. So trying to define that, the game for me is just trying to find that, get the timing really down and the material really get across how good it could be. So I think it's sort of the challenge of, can I do this? And also the fact that it's fun to do. It's a fun challenge. And just again, the material is so good.
Yeah, he was a incredible writer. There's a life to the writing. It's not just
Exactly.
just on paper. It has its own life and its own personality.
Right. And what I try to do with the material I chose for this, to sort of show an arc, because mostly he's very, very funny, but also like that scene on the river in Huckleberry Finn is amazing. There's so much packed in that one little scene where Huck has to choose what he's going to do. And then that piece at the end, when he's describing just the sunrise in the Mississippi. So he can write very seriously, he can write very funny, he can also write beautifully, just beautiful descriptions of nature. So showing the kind of the spread of what Twain could write.
Now, here's a question. I should know this. I know Grant visited Hartford, General Grant.
Yes.
Did he actually visit or stay overnight at the Mark?
He didn't stay at the house. Twain, I checked that out. That's the first thing I checked. Twain does speak at a Civil War veterans event that Grant was at, and he talks again about how he talks about how wonderful Grant was, but he says, at least I think I'm still a better writer than Grant. He says, I have that going for me. But they met, but he didn't stay at the house. I wish he had stayed at the house. It'd be great stories.
Now, Twain had an apartment in the city, and that's when he met, or when he spent a lot of time with Grant in the 1880s?
Yes, because he was going to New York often to meet with publishers and stuff too. So yeah, he would have a place to stay, or he'd stay in a hotel. He'd book a hotel for a week at a stretch. He lives in New York City. After his wife dies, he comes back to the States. This is when he sells the Hartford house because it's just too painful to go back. And he lives in New York for about a year. But New York's not really, he's not a city person. He actually comes back to Connecticut and builds a second house in Connecticut where he lives for the rest of his life.
And then he did a lot of his writing in Southern New York?
Yeah, he would divide the time out. The Hartford house gets really hot in the summer. So for July, August, they'd be up in Elmira, New York. And so he wrote a lot. There was a gazebo built for him this is his wife's family's property in Elmira. So he wrote in this gazebo in Elmira and then at the desk up at the billiards room in Hartford. So it's about 50-50 where he was writing. Yeah.
And what was it? Was it the marriage? I can't remember what brought him up from Missouri, from his boyhood area?
Well, he goes from Missouri. He ends up working on the river, which he loved. Then he has to stop doing that because of the war. He ends up going out to Nevada, then California, Then he's traveling around as a reporter. He meets his wife via a friend. He's on a trip going out to Europe, which becomes his first novel. And on the ship right out, this friend of his, Charlie Langdon, shows him a picture of his big sister, Olivia, and Sam's smitten. She's this attractive woman. They come back to the States after this trip, and Charlie sends him a telegram saying, come down to New York City on Christmas Eve. My whole family's going to go hear Charles Dickens read The Christmas Carol. So he goes to New York, here's Dickens read. He meets Olivia, his wife, or future wife, and he just falls head over heels for her. And she's totally different from him. She's very wealthy. She's very refined. She's college educated. They're wildly different, which makes them a great couple. But that's what brings him. He settles down in New England because he wants to be a New Englander, because that's sort of where the writers were. And he wants to live in Hartford because Hartford was this very high tech, very rich city at the time. So he wants to live in Hartford because also the neighborhood he moves into was famous. It's where Harriet Beecher Stowe lived, the Gillette family lived, all these major publishers lived in this neighborhood in Hartford.
Now, it was brought up in the comments, a little bit of a discussion about the reception of Huckleberry Finn, and how there was some concern over of the coarse language, what they termed coarse language. It seems as though the work overcame that, and apparently in recent years there has been some organizations, institutions that have continued the ban or banned it anew or something like that.
Yeah. The book first gets banned the year it comes out. The first place to ban it was actually the library in Concord, Mass, for coarse language. It's literally, they said, because he was writing in vernacular. He wasn't writing, it's written in the style of how people talked in those areas. I think that offended some of the blue bloods. And it's, the book was controversial because it was too I don't know, it showed too many dimensions to people. And, it was just kind of talking about, the inner workings of Huck's struggle to decide whether he turns Jim in or not. Later it got banned. I think now it gets banned because of the language. There's words in there that are really uncomfortable to work with, but that's how people talked then. You can't change that. But I think people who, especially now, who ban it are people who are not reading the book carefully, because there's so much going on, and it's clearly about this. It's called about the story of a boy with a warped conscience. This child has been raised being told slavery is the right thing to do, but his conscience is told that thing, but his heart says it's wrong. This is clearly wrong. And that scene on the river is where Huck comes to that realization that my society may condemn me for this, but it's just the right thing to do. But the book has always been controversial, and yet the banning the book has always upped the sales for Twain, so it worked out well for him.
Yeah. And it's interesting. That kind of sets up a question I have that relates to, I don't know if it could be, I don't think it's completely apocryphal, but there's a story that Twain was, casually involved with a band of, militia or Confederate militia.
Yeah.
Grant would have come into the same area, generally speaking, and they would have they disbanded, and he went off to Nevada, where his brother was governor, something like that.
He's working for the governor.
There.
Yeah. Twain is in a Confederate militia for about 2 weeks, and it was 24 or so. It was just it was not politically motivated. It was just it would be an adventure. None of these guys had any military training, and he writes a story about this called the history of a brief campaign that failed, which is sort of it's sort of a theatricalized version of this. But apparently what happens is he's out one night with his militia, on bivouac, and they hear someone coming in the dark, and they fire blindly into the dark and shoot a guy on a horse who's not wearing a uniform at all. And Twain at this point says, "This is stupid. I'm leaving." He becomes very anti-war throughout his life, and I think seeing this, just how easily things turned horrible, and he's like, he clearly thought we don't know what we're doing. We shouldn't be here.
Seems as though he dodged a bullet, possibly literally there, but
exactly. Yeah.
And it certainly, and they're both, enigmatic characters to some extent. I think Twain seemed to, he kind of played it, putting his heart on his sleeve, but I don't know that he really did. And Grant certainly kept pretty reserved. He was a good storyteller in private to his friends and family, but would blush and get very embarrassed when he had to make speeches. And He said after he got back from his world tour, I must be getting better at making speeches because my knees don't knock together like they used to.
Twain's first public speech was in California. He had just done a tour in Hawaii and was giving talks about it. That's how he was making his money then. And he said the first time he did it, he was terrified before he went on stage, terrified. And after that first time, he was fine. And that became what he did with his life. In fact, he becomes not only a writer, but he really is a showman. That first date with his wife, when he hears Dickens read the Christmas Carol, he writes a scathing review of Dickens' performance. He says, Dickens is this wonderful writer, and his words are only good if someone else is reading them. He also says, up close, Dickens looks just like a Scots Terrier. So performance is very important to Twain. He really does craft his performances. He's worried about, again, the timing, every syllable. He becomes very much, he's very important to get the performance really down right. He's very detailed in his work.
And it's interesting. Grant and Twain both had a wanderlust.
Yes.
Desire to see other cultures and other parts of the world, and they were both able at different times to indulge that. We know that General Grant went on a 2.5-year world tour. He circumnavigated the globe. I'm less familiar with, exactly Twain's travels, but
Twain's first travel, he goes through, this is when he's first starting out as a writer, through Southern Europe, the Holy Lands, and North Africa. That becomes that first novel, The Innocents Abroad. And then later, when he goes bankrupt, to make his money back, he goes on a world tour. He shuts the Hartford House down and goes across the states, down to Australia, up through India, through Europe to England. In fact, it's on this trip, while he's on this trip, that his oldest daughter passes away. She stayed home because she was in college. So he said that travel is fatal to prejudice. And I really think traveling shows him that people, for good and for bad, are just people.
Yeah, that's a powerful lesson to be, experiencing. It was very hard at that time, costly and hard, to even experience other cultures outside of the borders of your nation. I think that was difficult, but they certainly had a desire to do that. And they were able to do it. And I think they both came back. People saying about Grant's third term, they said, he's got that foreign policy experience now. He's,
right.
But Twain never. His brother got involved in politics. He never considered.
No, he definitely not. That was no, zero urge, zero urge. He would obviously comment on politics all the time, and he's involved with like social things in Hartford area. He founded a lot of clubs. He spoke regularly before the Hartford Club and the Hartford Women's Club and stuff. But no, he was definitely an observer. I think he had two drives in his adult life. The first was just to make money to support his family, but the other is I think what drove him as a writer was he really genuinely wanted to figure out how humans work. I think he was fascinated by how good humans can be and how bad we can be, and he was trying to figure out what's going on with us as a species. I think that's what makes this stuff so good, because he's really trying to find the common humanality of all of us.
Yeah, the study of human nature, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that makes sense, and that it's interesting. It goes to the core of what we both do, which is work at historic sites. And yes, the items themselves tell a story and they're interesting, but the reality is the what people learn, can learn if they're open to it, is things about human nature, because
right.
things change, and the world changes around us, but humans have had the same human nature and weaknesses and strengths
Exactly.
thousands of years. So
right, that's why the Twain material still works, because he's talking about stuff in the 1880s, but you relate to, you're like, yes, because people are still people. We still don't want to get caught by our wives swearing. We still, like we still have this. We're the same species, and that's why it still works. That's why the tour still works, I think, at the Twain House, anyway, because people are relating to stuff that happened 150 years ago, because we're still the same. We're still human.
I can see he'd be maybe compared like to a modern 20th century individual, somebody who's controversial and kind of pokes fun at humanity, is
right,
like George Carlin or something. Somebody who
very much. There's a direct line, I say, between him and Carlin, because Carlin also used language, and he's using language like a tool, but he's not shy about how he uses language. But he's not doing it to shock. He's doing it to probe. He's doing it to figure things out. I think you can draw a direct line from Twain to Carlin. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that whole thing with saying the thing everybody's thinking.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, Twain
and
seems
saying
to
it
have
really
done
well.
that.
So you're like, yes, that's what I was trying to say.
He really is able to put his what is it? I'm trying to come up with. He can really describe his thoughts properly and really
Exactly. Yeah.
eloquently, and I think, you know, in a way that's understandable. And it seems like a lot of his writings that I've read it is understandable. He didn't seem to have the same penchant for incredibly romanticized
Right. No, no, no.
19th century writing. If he did, it seemed to be poking fun at it.
Exactly. No, he doesn't. He doesn't like fancy language. He likes good language, but nothing, but good enough. He said the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. The right word is just the right word can be so perfect. And if you're close, it's eh.
Right, right. And it seemed like, when Grant was writing his book, he was very he was always modest, and he always didn't really think much of his own abilities and things like that. He was self-effacing, but he did, seek some reassurance and some critique from Twain. And Twain said, essentially would anybody, he had compared his memoirs to Caesar's memoirs, and it was I think he really gave Grant a lot of confidence, because I think Grant really looked up to him as an author and as an accomplished author, and to have that encouragement. Do you think the encouragement that Twain gave him was important to finishing?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I started reading the memoirs this summer. They're really good because Grant is writing for a different reason. He's writing historical, not a thing, but his language is so clear. It's not elaborate. It's succinct, but it's also pretty. Like he's a good writer. I think if this person who is this renowned author says this is good, I mean, how can you not be like feel more confident after someone says it? And Twain, I mean, I'm clearly very biased, is kind of the greatest author I think our country's produced. Again, huge bias, but I've read a lot of stuff. And I think Grant also was, I think, open to hearing, criticism. I think Twain said I think Twain gave him no, like, what you're doing is good, keep going, because I think Twain was really, really impressed by how clear and honest the writing was. It was very sincere. And I think for Twain, that's huge. You're not trying to fool me. You're not trying to impress me. You're just writing the truth. And for Twain, that's huge.
Yeah, and I think that was, Grant even made that statement that he wanted to see the history written and history written truthfully. That was his main goal and he did make a disclaimer in the beginning of the book, which I thought was really important, that this is how I saw things. This is a memoir. This is how I perceived and saw these things, whether or not others saw it the way I did. So he at least put that out there in the beginning. And he says, I'm just trying to give the best record I can. And he did make a reference to what we know as another perspective of the war, which is now termed the lost cause perspective.
Right.
Civil
right.
War. And he saw that actually being, coming out as a perspective. And, again, there may have been a bit of a motivating factor, of course, not the main factor for him writing his book, but a motivating factor. And, do you see any motivating factor in Twain other than, I mean, it seems like there was more than just money in his.
Absolutely. No, I mean, the money was important to him just because but he writes Huckleberry Finn because he goes back to Missouri long after the war is over and sees that nothing has changed. And he's horrified. He says, why did all those people just die? When nothing's gotten better. And that's what prompts Huckleberry Finn to be written. And at the end of Huckleberry Finn, I read it a lot, so I know it pretty well. Tom Sawyer shows up at the very end of Huckleberry Finn, and Tom is kind of a jerk. And Tom is representing, I think, for Twain, the people who learned nothing from the war. Mm-hmm. They don't understand how this large population of people who had been enslaved, what their lives are like, what they were really like. And so, because the ending is very jarring. And I think until I knew Twain, but I'm like, oh, Tom is representing what made him write the book. This not getting what just happened and why it was important. So I mean, and he's again, I think Twain's trying to write stuff that'll be popular and sell, but he's also trying to write to explain why we do what we do and how we work, like deep down how we work. And that's why at the house we get people from all over the world who've read the books, because they don't resonate with Americans, they resonate with people. That's the genius. I've had people from, I actually have a friend who grew up in Soviet Russia who was required to read Huckleberry Finn in high school, which is great. I had someone who came from Thailand just to take the tour, which is incredibly a lot of pressure, because the books are relatable. People understand what's going on in the books because they're people too.
Yeah, I mean, that's just laying human nature out there bare, you know. I think that's,
Exactly.
and some people didn't like that apparently, you know, they didn't.
Right, right. But he does it in a way that's not didactic. It's funny, so you get kind of pulled in, like, because so it's more like, oh yeah, I recognize that, I'm like that, or oh yeah, that guy is totally like that. So he's not. I mean, he's not like pushing at you his agenda. He's saying, here's what I see, and I can tell about you because I think for Twain also the humor is it's funny, and then it's a little sad, and then it's funnier on a deeper level because he's playing at all these levels of he sees human nature as sort of funny, but we're also kind of tragic. But he thinks on the big scale, our tragedy, because we're such a small dot in the universe, is also kind of funny.
Yeah,
He's
and I
really
remember,
layered.
yeah, and I remember, you know, one of the things, it's interesting that he was very, he had strong opinions, didn't mind making them known. I remember his defense of Grant being the true author of his memoirs was
Yes.
pretty amazing. I think he called the newspaper and something like a bunch of unmedicated closet paper, you know, toilet paper basically is
He's not subtle. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think, you know, I think that may have been a little bit of a difference between Grant and him,
Oh,
but
yeah.
you know, it's the same as, you know, Grant and his staff member John Rollins, who would you know curse up a blue storm or a blue cloud
Mm,
of curse words, and you
right.
know, Grant didn't curse himself, but you know, it was almost you know, cathartic or something, you know, to have.
Right. Oh,
So maybe
Twain.
having Twain sitting there saying all the things Grant liked, you know, he just
Exactly. And
and
apparently Twain was an artist with profanity. Apparently he was just brilliant at swearing. We have no actual records of what he would say, but apparently lots of hyphenation, lots of blasphemy. And apparently it was seriously, it was an art form for him.
yeah, yeah. I bet imagine Twain would have been one of the performances I would have wanted to see if I, you know, could go back to that era or live.
Picture early George Carlin, and I think you get the same
Yeah,
effect for the
yeah.
1890s. Yeah.
Right, right, right. You know, that's wonderful. Well, this has been fun. Any final thoughts?
First of all, thanks for letting me do this.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, live is always better. It's very weird recording that without an audience to do your timing off of. But I learned a lot about recording and editing. Not enough, but I learned a lot. But it was a great chance. And also it got me to start reading the memoirs, and they're so good. I'm really enjoying them.
Well, that's wonderful. And of course, you know, open invitation to you to come and see Grant Cottage.
Oh, that's gonna happen. That's gonna
And
happen.
you know, bring the suit with you. We're going to take some
There you
pictures.
go.
And
I'm in.
I'll put my top hat on. We'll get the whole thing going.
Nice.
You know,
Absolutely.
yeah, that would be wonderful to have you come and visit, and we'll see about a future presentation on site, possibly next year during the bicentennial year. Uh,
Cool.
you know, of course, we're going to put. We want to you know, encourage people to visit the Mark Twain House. I assume it's open at this time, and
We're kind of back to sort of a normal schedule now.
right,
Yeah.
right, excellent. So you know, visit the Mark Twain House if you're anywhere near Hartford, Connecticut. It's a wonderful experience, beautiful house. What is your just in closing? What is any favorite features or things that draw you in at the house?
Oh, for me, I mean, my second favorite room is the library, which is beautiful, but the billiards room is where it's at. The billiards, it's a fun room, but also there's that desk in the corner where Tom Sawyer happened, Huckleberry Finn happened. For me, that's the reason I work there. I'm next to the place where Huckleberry Finn was written. That's huge. And please come visit the house. It's really worth, I mean, for multiple reasons. It's worth the trip. If you can book your trip online first, book your tickets online first, because we get busy.
And you do offer still offer or currently offer living history tours?
Yeah, they're I think we're doing them every day, and it's from a point of view of one of the servants or one of the daughters.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And you know, we just started doing that at Grant Cottage again, doing living history tours. Very popular. You know, a little bit more of a immersive experience, and I think people
Exactly.
just like the presentations that you do as a living historian. They really bring history to life. And again, you know, I appreciate all your effort in as you mentioned before, trying to you know, really putting the work in. And people don't realize how much work living historians put in to try to get the personality right, to try to get the speech right. And I couldn't even come close to matching that Southern accent if I tried. So
It's terrifying to do. It's terrifying.
I thought it was done very well, and I certainly appreciate all the effort, and I think everybody else did. It's definitely wonderful to have you come and perform for us here virtually. And again, in the future, we look forward to having you on site.
Absolutely.
Thanks again to Kit Webb. And if you get a chance, visit the Mark Twain House in Connecticut. And thanks to everyone for your support. And if you're interested in memberships or getting involved in any way at Grant Cottage, just visit us at grantcottage.org. Again, I'll include links to both Grant Cottage and the Mark Twain House in the comments of the video here. And I encourage everybody to check out those websites for more information. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.